Good morning. I'll try and hand over the microphone again as soon as possible to Tobias Armborst, and after that to Kenny Coopers. The theme of this morning, that's a Freudian slip, participation and community power, is actually it's a great Michelle's introduction sets it up very well, because participation and community power is actually all about how do we complement, or how do we form an alternative for the evils and the dangers and the incompleteness of top-down state planning. We have two actually, in one of the best slogans or one-liners ever formulated by Dutch planning propaganda has been the slogan "Mensen maken een stad," and which literally means people build a city, or people make a city. This was used in propaganda material, especially in the Reconstruction period, just after the war. But mensen maken een stad can be read in two ways. It can be read in the sense of it is people make a city. It can be read as it is the people out of which the city is built. Or it can be read as it is the people themselves who build the city. So it's either the people as the ones who have, to use a scientific term, a scholarly term, it is the people who have the agency themselves, or it is the people who are the subjects or the objects of planning. So are the people the bricks, or are the people the bricklayers? That is more or less the question. Now, I think our two guests have some things in common. They are both a part of minorities in the United States. We have Tobias Armborst, who is a German American. And we have Kenny Coopers, who is a Belgian American. They both have been trained in Harvard, but Tobias has been trained first in Aachen, then went to Harvard to study architecture, and then went to Brooklyn to start the office of Interborough. And Interborough is a great group of people. We know them very well. We worked together with them on the last Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam in 2009. Interborough consists of Tobias, of Georgine Theodore, and Daniel Doka. They have done fantastic projects, like, for example, the design of the plaza of the World Trade Center Memorial, and they have made a beautiful and very provocative study of intentional communities, of master planned communities in the United States, of which Tobias will speak later. Kenny was trained first in Leuven as an architect, then went to Harvard, and now holds a title of which I can only be incredibly jealous. I can hardly... I'm speechless with envy, because he is the Rayner Banham Fellow at the University of New State. See, I cannot talk about it anymore. I'm just too much envy. The Rayner Banham Fellow. See, it's Rayner Banham, of course, is for us architectural historians our biggest hero. He is our Jesus, Mohammed, and Buddha at the same time. So Kenny Coopers treads in his footsteps and uses that to do research. He has published, or he has finished, defended his dissertation called "In Search of the User," which is academic research, architectural historical research, but also does a fantastic streetwise research, such as into the street vendors in Los Angeles, the kind of you could say the urbanistic potential of street vending in Los Angeles, also on walking as what you call do-it-yourself urbanism, but also the slightly kinky, I think, subject of youth camps in Germany and the United States until the 40s of the last century. So we have two fantastic speakers. Tobias will speak of will go first. He will speak of you could say one paradigm of participation. One paradigm of state is the state as a federation of communities, with the state trying to create as much freedom for the communities to do it themselves, which is the American situation. And Kenny will then speak of the totally opposite paradigm of state, which is the French state, where from a central republican point of view, the state creates what Michele called the polis for everyone, and then once they have done that, starts worrying about the participation of the people. So we will have these two people now participating in this conference by presenting their stories, and I would like Tobias to go first. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Wouter. Again, I'm Tobias Armborst here as part of Interboro, Brooklyn firm which I run with Georgine Theodore and Daniel Dioka. And the project that I would like to show you today actually started in Rotterdam about 2 years ago, when we were invited by Kees Christianse to sub-curate the American section of the Rotterdam Architecture Biennial. I'm sure many of you have been there, have participated in this show, so you know that the title of the show was Open City, Designing Coexistence, and the particular session we were asked to tackle was named Community, the American Way of Living. And when we received the invitation, we wondered what in the world is community and what is the open city? Well, open city immediately made us think of Greenwich Village, approximately 61. But then we thought that if we were going to deal with American communities of today, or American cities of today, we would have to look elsewhere, namely basically in those areas where most people live, the majority of Americans live, can afford to live, those areas that were formerly known as the suburbs. And we particularly decided to look at private master planned communities. You might know that private master planned communities, or the private master planned community, is an urban typology, or maybe I should say an urban product line, that somewhat has become dominant of urbanization in the United States roughly since the 1980s. There's this astonishing number that almost 80% of new housing in America was produced in some degree master planned, some degree gated communities, which is sort of a pre-2008 number, so at the time when housing was actually still produced in the United States. And to get an idea of how this actually plays out there, we decided to look at every master plan community that had been built or planned over the previous year in the United States, just to get a sense of what's really happening out there. There had been a fair amount of literature about this type of urbanization, primarily in the 1990s, and most of it quite alarmist. And sort of our hunch going into this was that maybe these things are a little bit more benign than they appear in this alarmist literature. And there hadn't been really a survey recently. But in addition to this academic literature, there was this vast other amount of literature about these developments, namely the very carefully produced marketing material. And one could say that the nice thing about this type of package development for an urban researcher is that it always comes with its own literature, so making the research a lot easier. So you can basically call up, and we did that. We called up every master plan community that had been planned over the year before, and ordered marketing material. So there are a couple of hundreds of these brochures now in our office, and it turned out to be a quite rich reading. We also constantly get new material, and we get a lot of follow-up calls over the course of the day. Since the beginning of the crisis, sort of increasingly desperate sounding corresponding follow-up calls. And it also appears that the sales offices are coming up with new ways of marketing these places. So for example, we just received this somewhat tempting offer to spend a 3-day weekend in some of Arizona's premier golf communities for only $69. But anyway, so this pile of brochures really gives us a window into the kind of product lines that are out there at this point of time. You see here, just flashing by a couple of these covers of those brochures. You see what's on there. Hardly architecture, mainly natural features, landscapes, sometimes people, often playing golf. Right. It's also interesting to look at the imagery that's used in these, sort of the stage setting of the imagery in these brochures, people on the photos. There's always, as a general rule, always one African-American person someplace on each page, just for legal reasons. You get a glimpse of the kind of architectural typologies that are offered here. And we used the material to do some quantitative comparison. We're starting with house and lot sizes. Then also the amenities that are offered, right? 64% gated, golf 50% almost, swimming pools, the majority of them, and then the language that appears in these brochures. 30% of the brochures use the word dream, and then just over a half of the brochures somewhere use the word lifestyle to market their products. Sustainability appears 21%. Only 4% of those communities are accessible in other ways than by car, though, so there seems to be a slight difference. So based on this information, we actually constructed for the show in Redburn this imaginary road trip of a sort of sample of the more interesting examples. We just zoom into some examples. We see, for example, Peace Village, which is an Amadi community just outside of Toronto. We see the kind of architecture of this community, sorts of amenities. So another one is Serenbe in Georgia. It's a sort of more crunchy themed community with an organic farm at its center. And sort of some quotes from this advertisement material, or Rainbow Vision, which is a gay retirement community. So you see a number of these very, very strongly themed communities. You know, communities for golf, fishing, horseback riding. Sky Village, which is a community for hobby astronomers, with this particular new architectural typology where hacienda meets observatory. There's Jumbo Lair, which is a community of hobby pilots, where the landing strip replaces the suburban cul-de-sac, and the two-car garage is hard to read. So the two-car garage replaces, or is replaced here by a hangar. Then there's this one, which is Ave Maria, which I'm going to get back to. It's a community for Catholics in Florida, with a giant church-like structure in the middle of it. You see the... So it's an astonishing landscape out there, sort of with this variety of themed communities that nonetheless seem to share a couple of features. For one, they're all privately developed, right? So they're in the first place for-profit products. They're packaged with a unified design language and catering towards specific lifestyle groups, a very well-defined, clearly defined target audience. They're limited, right? Fairly defined in size, sharing that with Garden City, and they don't usually grow, right? And most importantly, they have shared communally owned amenities like a swimming pool, golf course, or a communal green. And looking at the way these shared amenities play out in the plan, we do find strange similarities with earlier projects of planned community, right? There are the literal references to the Garden City diagram, right? Like here in Sun City, where the Garden City Greenbelt is replaced by a golf course. Surrounding the defined size of Sun City, a retirement community in Arizona. But then particularly we find over and over again the model of Redburn, New Jersey, right? Redburn, the 28 American garden city that was designed by Clarence Stein, where we really find sort of the direct precedent for the community-owned amenity that has become such a staple of the master plan community. So I want to just trace things back briefly to Redburn. This is Redburn on the right, the plan of Redburn, which emerges here on this cover of Clarence Stein's 1951 book, sort of in the forest as a kind of epiphany there to the wandering, short-sleeved RPA folks in the forest. Redburn, of course, was the RPPA, the Regional Plan Association of America's sort of showcase garden city, right? The RPAA had been founded in '23 by Stein, who, after the success of Sunnyside Gardens, Queens, started the City Housing Corporation, sort of a new town association that began with planning of Redburn in '28. And the initial plan was very much following the Garden City, right? Sort of communal ownership and sustainability, sustainability that were such key features of the Garden City here. So this is the original plan for Redburn, planned for 30,000 people, which of course is exactly the number of residents that Howard prescribes for the Garden City, and as I just learned, Aristotle already did 2,000 years ago. And it's also the number of residents that Clarence Perry puts down for the size of the neighborhood, with this 5-minute, quarter-mile walking radius to the elementary school. And this sort of was the Perry's was really the template for Redburn. After the crash, only 2 of Redburn's units were realized, these 2, each one sort of a super block bounded by this kind of ring road with a bunch of cul-de-sacs. Here you see some sort of seasonal imagery. And then at the center is this green communal space, this sort of village green, which all the houses faced initially as a communally owned amenity, which is quite nice here on Halloween. And then a pedestrian circulation system that connects via underpass to the elementary school. And so this kind of diagram you find over and over again in today's master plan communities, the communities that were built since the 80s. One could say minus the ambition, right? Minus the political content. Then the follow-up for Redburn was Greenbelt Maryland. One of 3 or 4 realized planned communities from the New Deal Resettlement Authority. This is 1937. You see it today, it's quite nice. It has a monument to domestic tranquility, and it has been recently turned into a naturally occurring retirement community. This is the marketing brochure of the time, flipping through with a diagram and some information about the value of planning as the answer to the sort of the toxic conditions of the city on the one hand, and the numbness of suburban subdivisions on the other. So this is making a strong connection between the community of pre-industrial England and then, or New England, I should say, and then Redburn and Greenbelt, so from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft to Gemeinschaft. Here, in opposition to the city. Then, just very briefly, sort of in the late 60s and 70s, there are a couple of interesting examples of these much larger master plan communities, right? Radically different from the Greenbelt towns at that point, because entirely driven by private developers as sort of profit-oriented endeavors. Maybe most interesting, Columbia, Maryland, which is a new town for 90,000, opened in '67 between Washington and Maryland. Sort of a diagrammatic plan, which looks pretty familiar, right, to you guys probably. Columbia was also one of the earlier examples, and that's why it's sort of interesting to us, of extensive marketing, right, along the lines of what we see today. Again, like the brochures that I showed you in the beginning, this is not so much emphasizing the layout of the community or the architecture, but the lifestyle, right? This is an example of a magazine ad from, I think, 1968, right, where you where this is really all about targeting the specific people. Here, this really seems like sort of the Mad Men era version of Ebenezer Howard's Town Country Magnet, right? A place that combines the advantages of the rural and the urban, right? In this case, good education and horseback riding. Anyhow, Colombia is sort of somewhat of an isolated experiment, and it's only in the mid-'80s that we see this explosive growth and construction of private master plan communities, starting in Florida and particularly the Washington region. And these communities at that point are almost entirely based on a new urbanist model, or as they call it, traditional neighborhood development model, TND. Sort of the model is Seaside and then Kentlands, both designed by Joanny Platter-Zyberg, that really become the precedent for many of the new planned communities. And then sort of the late 90s on, we can see this stylistic diversification that I described before. There's no longer the exclusive TND model, but sort of a wide spectrum of design frameworks targeting a variety of lifestyles. But the development formula that took off so suddenly in the mid-'80s, and it hasn't changed much since, in spite of this diversification in lifestyle and design, was based on a couple of institutional innovations that were really crucial for the success of these private master plan communities, creating a set of powerful tools, right? The first being an innovation in zoning, planned unit development as a new zoning model. Zoning is basically, as you all know, the main tool of planning in the United States, and in its traditional form, it regulates use and density on a lot-by-lot base. Now, with PUD, density is aggregated, so a density is based not on individual building lots within a development parcel, but on the entire parcel, and it sort of really allows the clustering for buildings to set aside large areas to preserve natural features or build a golf course, again, like here in Kentlands. And this was very much sort of pushed by new urbanists, right? And it's almost a necessity for the kind of new urbanist communities that were built to have this sort of zoning. But it also turned out to be very attractive for municipality, right? Because it implies the private provision of amenities, and it's popular with the developers. The second innovation, or this is a little bit old, but the second factor that really came to bloom in the 80s are CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and regulations, and these are the sort of private planning codes within the planned community, right? Codes that are highly specific and highly prescriptive, circumscribing people's ability to change or modify houses and yards. And these are drafted by developers, along with the development of the community, and then they become they're implemented or managed by the homeowners association. So the developer hands it off to the homeowners association, and these are often very strange, very detailed regulations. There's quite some literature on this, such as Privatopia, Mackenzie's book, which has a number of bizarre examples, where there are weight limits on dogs, for example, and people have to get rid of their dogs once they get too fat and that sort of thing. Very, very successful, upheld in the courts for a number of reasons. But then the third factor is the communal ownership of amenities. A model of ownership that developed in the 60s primarily, where the kind of shared amenities, the swimming pool, the golf course, is in communal ownership, owned by all residents. All residents pay for management and maintenance as well. So in a golf course community, typically the homes are privately owned, but then the golf course is owned and paid for by everybody in the community. So there's this strange communal thing going on here that is strangely reminiscent of the Redburn Commons, right? But again, the driving force here is not some nostalgic idea of community or the neighborhood unit or the New England Gemeinschaft, but it's based on a lifestyle, or one might argue, a soft exclusion. As a matter of fact, legal scholar Trehilowitz calls this kind of shared amenity an exclusionary amenity, for the reason that if you're not interested in playing golf, you're presumably not interested in paying for the maintenance of a golf course, and you're not going to move into a golf course community. So in effect, golf course keeps you out. Strehilowitz even argues that the proliferation of golf communities in the 80s had much to do with the racial dynamics of golf at the time. So a way for white people who want to live in an all-white community to do so without doing anything illegal. And that brings us brings me to the end of this presentation as well, but it also brings us back to Ave Maria, which is this Catholic community in Florida with this big church in the middle. Or a church-like structure, which is sort of an exclusionary amenity par excellence, right? The founder of this community, the arch-conservative owner of Domino's Pizza, really wanted a community for and of Catholics, but it's obviously illegal to exclude non-Catholics from a place based on their religion. So the church, which is communally owned and paid for through maintenance fees and so on, becomes in effect an exclusionary amenity, right? Why would you want to pay for the maintenance of a church if you don't use it? So these amenities become part of a, one might say, new technology of exclusion. It's sort of an answer to the question, how do you create homogeneous communities when you have a Fair Housing Act that prohibits you from using things like racial zoning, restrictive covenants, or racial steering, and all these other methods that worked so well previously. And the crucial aspect of this new technology of exclusion, we would say, is a shift from race and class to things that become a proxy for race and class, namely something vague called a lifestyle. Thank you.